There's a story going round that a new way has been found. Salvation for the soul, that's the way the story goes. How this man can set you free, he even died for you and me. Oh, it's the story of the man from Galilee. Yes, it's the story of the man from Galilee. Galilee, Galilee. Oh, it's the story of the man from Galilee. Galilee, Galilee. Oh, it's the story of the man from Galilee. Oh, they say it is so real that it's something you can feel. Brings a new love in your heart and from sin sets you apart. Calls your blinded eyes to see. It got its start at Calvary. Yes, it's the story of the man from Galilee. Oh, it's the story of the man from Galilee.
Well, this is a story about two internet randos who didn't know each other. And then one day, one of them said, "Hey, other internet rando, what if we started a podcast?" And those two internet randos got together with tin cans on string, or so it sounded at the time. And 5 years later, Chortles Weekly and Presbyterian continue to do Presbycast. There have been some small upgrades in the meantime, but wouldn't you know it, we've got the same freaking guests coming back time and time again, including this time, the return of our very first guest on Presbycast, which was Dr. Daryl Hart, who is once again here with us on the show. So I guess this is we did do a show on the official date, even though we didn't realize it, so this will be our belated paper anniversary special, the 5-year Presbycast anniversary spectacular. So welcome everybody. We of course have a topic tonight which we will handle with all the whimsical sarcasm it deserves, and that's exactly what you'd come to expect when you come to this show. So Chortles, what are we doing?
Well, we got our friend, of course, Dr. Daryl Hart. We've got show Ombudsman Amish Ambush as part of the panel. And Dr. Hart, are you're up there in Michigan, right?
Actually, in Massachusetts.
Okay.
We came.
Okay,
at our cottage.
So I thought that not Maine. It's an old Methodist camp or something.
Yeah, it's an old Methodist campground. Still, they started in 1859. Still active with religious programming in the summer.
Hey, bring your boom mic a little closer to your mouth there.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go. And I see the cat. It's hard not to. I've got a little.
I don't know why that. I wonder if I should flip it around. Maybe that's it.
This is true vintage Presbycast here.
Yeah, this is 5 years and I still haven't figured it out.
Well, we could tell the story of your microphone, but we'll just leave that. We'll leave it alone.
It feels a lot longer than 5 years, though. It feels more like 10. Is that good or bad?
That's what Mrs. Presby says every single time.
Yeah, my wife encouraged it, for us to actually start, and I'm pretty sure she regrets it too. But that's okay.
And now you're neglecting a dog while you do it, so it's ear abuse and animal abuse all rolled into one now.
Well, the dog's not in here now, but if my dog and Daryl's cats could get together, it would be epic. We've been hunting rabbits tonight in the neighborhood, unsuccessfully as always. My wife has banned the eating of rabbits, but I'm trying to make it happen. So our friend,
very good. There's a wide range of things you can make with a rabbit.
Well, I would trust you to know that. So, Amish, you're our show advisor. You're like the man behind the scenes. This is our 5-year anniversary. What do you got to say about that?
Congratulations. I remember listening to the first Presby cast on a trip up to Ohio, and my oldest exclaiming after about 20 minutes said, is that Mr. Miserable on the radio? And so, yeah. So it's been a tradition of listening to you in the car with the kids since then.
Have you noticed that their behavior and sanctification has improved as a result?
No, it's actually gotten worse. So
okay, well, so you travel with
sanctification is doing some Olympian level lifting in that sentence.
yes.
Well, it's been interesting, and who knows how much longer we'll do it, but it could be a good long time. So our actual 5-year anniversary to the day was last week. We had a show 1 week ago, and it was on PCA revoice issues. It stacked up listens more quickly than any show ever has, which tells you about the interest level in all of this. But we forgot that was the anniversary. So we're 5 years and 1 week, and we're again over 300 shows. We celebrated 300 shows back in I don't know, when was it, Presby? February or March?
Yeah,
Something like that. So we're probably at 320 or so now, although it's a little hard to count big numbers and all. Well, somebody sent us not too long ago a sort of a time capsule. It was a promotional documentary paid for by the Northern Church. At that time, in 1974, Dr. Hart, that would have still been the UPC USA.
Yes.
At that point, before the reunion, which formed the PC USA in 1983. Of course, they were the PC USA in Machen's day. Now, we all know if you want to learn anything definitive about Presbyterian history, you go to Joe Carter, because Joe Carter of Gospel Coalition 9 Things About This or That fame, he did a little info piece about Presbyterian history and denominations, and he blew it terribly. He called the original name for the OPC the Presbyterian Church of North America. So he couldn't have been much more confusing, and it still hadn't been corrected as of about an hour ago. So if you want to know about Presbyterian history and the alphabet soup and all that, go to Dr. Hart at Old Life or on Twitter, but not to Jolt and Joe Carter. That's not the ticket. But anyway, we found this documentary. Someone sent it to us. It's from 1974. That's a year after the formation of the PCA, and it was probably being produced right at the time that the PCA was being formed in '73. And it's vintage '70s. Frank Reynolds is the host. And I thought, oh, cool, maybe Frank Reynolds was a Presbyterian. Now, Frank Reynolds was like the Jake Tapper or the Pete Williams of his day. Do you remember him, Dr. Hart?
Oh, yeah. He's the Ted Baxter of his day.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he does have that. He does have that look.
And that voice, too. It's anyway.
Which we'll hear very soon. Anyway, it's a little 28-minute documentary. We have the ability to stop and start it. So we're going to kind of give it the Mystery Science Theater 3000 treatment, maybe. And but there's some good history in it, some good Presbyterian history, but they omit a few things as well. So we'll provide a little running commentary, and I'm sure for a mostly audio podcast, that it's just going to be fantastic to have a movie that we're talking about. So when they hit sort of audio lulls, maybe we'll fill a bit then. But I think we should just go ahead and start it, and I think it'll be interesting for people who watch this on YouTube. Usually we're only going to get about 300 or 400 views on a big show on YouTube. That's a fraction of the podcast downloads, but it's growing. So that's one thing that's changed in the last 5 years. So let me cue this up, and we'll just see. And this is Dr. Hart understands some of these things, because we should say that your first degree was in film, was it not?
It was.
So this is an old 16 millimeter. It's color. I think one of the things to watch for is Frank's clipboard. He has a clipboard it's not a fancy clipboard. It's like the clipboard my dad, the high school basketball coach, used to carry and occasionally slam and break. But it looks like he picked that clipboard up, in the technical truck. It's not anything fancy. But now Frank Reynolds wouldn't have come cheap at this time.
Exactly.
He was a pretty big deal. So
Yeah.
that tells you how much money they were playing with. The production values are good. I mean, the lighting is kind of crappy, and it is shot on faded 16 millimeter film. But it's something. It would be very expensive to produce today. So I don't know who would do it today. Maybe Martin Bashir, who used to attend Redeemer in New York. He would be the guy who would do this today, I suppose. So let's start it. We have to adjust the volume a bit, but I think we're going to be okay. So one of the things I want you to notice is I heard the theme music reminded me of something, and I'm thinking that's Bonanza, but it wasn't Bonanza. It was the similar to Bonanza, a TV Western, Big Valley. It had Barbara Stanwyck in it. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
The music, it sounds like a TV Western, and I don't know why that's appropriate to Presbyterians, but maybe after we hear a few seconds, Dr. Hart will have opinions on the suitability of the background music. But here we go. That's all. Okay, it's got that old countdown. Beautiful. And it's going to be a little dedication on the first screen to some guy who looks like a newspaper journalist who apparently was the PR director, or he was the visual archivist for the UPC and an historian like Dr. Hart. So it's very, very dramatic. It says Frank Reynolds of ABC News. He worked for more than one network. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second. Now, is this at the National Presbyterian Church in D.C.?
I guess.
I sort of think it is. And the National Presbyterian Church in D.C. is the reason that the PCA had to change its name.
Exactly.
It started as the National Presbyterian Church and was sued by this church, as I understand, that was associated with the UPCNA. So the National Presbyterian Church is what I think we're looking at here. So
I'm just surprised you can find that much green space in a DC church environment, but maybe it's outside the center or something. I've never been there.
Yeah, I think you should go there. But they may mention that, but and you don't see any bullet holes or gunfire or anything. So here we go. There's the clipboard.
I'm Frank Reynolds, and this is the National Presbyterian Church and Center. When Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, made his first trip to America, he said he was dismayed to find the plane full of gnomes, international spies, and Presbyterians. Presbyterians don't mind the company of gnomes, spies, or even poets, but that's hardly the way to locate the Presbyterian faith. Where do Presbyterians come from? Some people think they're all
That's
from
what Joe
Scotland.
Carter's still wondering.
The old joke asks, what did the first...
Well, Billy,
two
when a
Scotsmen
man and a
do
woman
when
love
they
each other
came
very
to
much?
America? The answer, one started the first Presbyterian church, the other started the second Presbyterian church.
So right there, he's saying that the two Scotsmen came over and they immediately began to feud, and they had the first Presbyterian church and the second. So if you read the Joe Carter piece in the Gospel Coalition, he made much of the splits in Presbyterianism. And I mean, I think Baptist churches certainly split too, and they're not even in real denominations. So in effect, there are tens of thousands of Baptist denominations, but still only, 50 Presbyterian. So we're not all that divisive. But that's the opening joke. So
Just across the street. But would it surprise you to learn that more Presbyterians came to America from Ireland and England than from Scotland? What do Presbyterians look like?
Powers
People
Booth.
regard them as middle-class capitalists.
They look like Powers Booth.
You know, I was watching the ARP General Synod today. You probably weren't watching that, Dr. Hart. I'm sorry you missed it. But I made the observation to some ARP friends on our Discord server that most of the ARP pastors look like high school football coaches. So, whatever Frank says here, Presbyterians, yeah.
This was made about the same time as Woody Allen's Love and Death, which is his take on Russian stuff, literature, French Napoleonic Wars and whatnot. But there's a scene where he's trying to explain, one of the characters is trying to explain to a son or grandson what Jews look like, which is much more poignant, thinking about what Jews look like. And some of them have horns and some of them have stripes is part of the joke. And anyway, it was just, when I saw this, I was thinking immediately of those lines from Love and Death.
All right, and this was made in the Watergate days, really. I mean, Watergate
Right.
was going on, and so when I think
we should again mention Nixon did nothing wrong.
Well, that's what you say. But when I think Watergate, I think the wide ties with the big knot and the long lapels and the polyester sport coat, which is what Frank's wearing here. But it's fairly tasteful as 70s sport coats go. So really only I and Dr. Hart are old enough to remember any of that. So let's rejoin.
Presbyterians came to America from Ireland and England, then from Scotland. What do Presbyterians look like? Some people regard them as middle-class capitalists with a worship so cold you could skate down the aisle.
Yeah, but what are the bad
Others
things
say the
about
church
them?
programs remind them of a lunatic asylum on fire. In fact, neither description is accurate.
Okay, so the Frozen Chosen, but I think what he's referring to with the lunatic asylum on fire is probably a reference to, 60s and later radical Presbyterians. We do know that the PCUSA took up some radical causes right about that time, and I believe that's what he refers to. So certainly, we're gonna hear a lot about civic religion and probably the intersection of the American Presbyterians and social issues. So we'll.
It could be also a reference, though, to revivalism. I mean, Presbyterians were very prominent in the first Pretty Good Awakening, and even the second, with Finney being ordained to the church. The second Great Awakening was not as enthusiastic, perhaps, as the first. But anyway, I wonder if that's also what the script writers had in mind.
Yeah, let's hear. We'll back up a little. It's a little imprecise, but maybe we'll be able to make more of that line.
As middle-class capitalists with a worship so cold you could skate down the aisle. Others say the church programs remind them of a lunatic asylum on fire.
The church programs,
In fact, neither description is accurate.
That's right.
To touch the uniqueness of a Presbyterian, might as well start.
Hold on. Now, I would not recommend trying to touch the uniqueness of a Presbyterian. That's just me.
That's like that Depeche Mode lyric where it tells you to reach out and touch faith.
Yeah.
Every old church lady shuddered.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that's a bad idea in 2021 because you wouldn't want to bring down the ire of, of Beth Moore and many other people. So
times do change, though.
Yes, mores and customs and what's allowable in the public square a little different. So we might hear that line again, but nobody break up.
Others say the church programs remind them of a lunatic asylum on fire. In fact, neither description is accurate. To touch the uniqueness of a Presbyterian, might as well start with the theological father, John Calvin. What did he think a Presbyterian was? Calvin was a French lawyer and an admirer of
Hey,
Martin
Chortles,
Luther.
I got a joke real quick.
If
Oh, certainly.
So, what do you call 100 French lawyers at the bottom of the sea?
A statistic.
Un bon debut.
Okay, well, I'll probably get that tomorrow. So I do think this is the National Presbyterian Church, and they have a very modern monument to J.C. That's not the second person of the Trinity. It's John Calvin. But here we go.
Calvin was a French lawyer and an admirer of Martin Luther. If Luther was the heart of the Reformation, then Calvin was its mind. Both men were afire with the same ideas: the priesthood of all believers, the authority of the Bible, the purity of the church, and above all, justification by grace through faith. Grace means that God demands from us what only God, working through us, can achieve. Since this is the core of Christianity, the Reformers did not feel they were creating a new church, but reforming the old one.
All right, well, that's, so far, theologically, quite accurate. And if Frank Reynolds was a Roman Catholic, as I suspect, and as I was able to find from, very serious internet research involving Wikipedia, his funeral was in a Catholic church in Chicago, I think. But if he's a Roman Catholic, he's actually he's committing treason here, I think. And
He did go to Wabash College, though, which is related to the Presbyterian Church. If it may have even been a Presbyterian college at the time when he went. So I wonder if he may be converted at a certain point and or married a Roman Catholic woman. But I'm suspecting that the Presbyterian Church being able to get him to do this, there had to be some kind of Presbyterian affinity. I wonder, anyway.
yeah, I had the same thought and thought that there might be a marital connection. So on with Calvin and Luther.
Most histories present only a toy Calvin, a tiny fragment of a towering and many-sided personality. At 27, he published the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which overnight became a think piece for Baptists, Anglicans, and Congregationalists.
That's interesting. So I think we have the formation of the Gospel Coalition with Baptist, Anglicans, and whoever else he said there. I think recognizing that Baptist could be Calvinists in 1974 they were either wrong or they were very prophetic and incisive, or maybe they know the 18th and 19th century Baptists, but I don't know. What do you make of that, Doctor?
Well, that I was picking up on that less, although I think you have a point there. But it's striking throughout the whole video. It takes the temperature of the PCUSA and also just more generally of mainstream Presbyterianism in America in the 70s, and it feels odd from our perspective today to have such a high view of Calvin. I mean, Calvin is a big figure in the history of the West. But the doctrines of election, the doctrine of predestination that always gets hung around Calvin's neck, not to mention the incident with Servetus, it's a little bit surprising that there's not more qualification to this, and they didn't pick someone else as sort of the intellectual father of Presbyterianism. But
yes, so the Northern Church would have been more Bardian by this time than early 20th century liberals. So I guess the Bardians were a little more friendly to Calvin maybe than the Auburn Affirmationists. Although you could speak to that, I'm just guessing.
I think that's that's probably right, but it's still striking that if you're sorting through the history of Protestantism, Reformed Protestantism, that you come up with Calvin as the seed from which Presbyterianism emerges. I mean, there's a lot of truth to that, and it's not inaccurate to say that, but it's just, again, it's surprising that there's not a little bit more squeamishness about Calvin the way there is today.
Right. Yep. So let's proceed.
He was never ordained, but his academy trained great numbers of clergy from all over Europe. He was richly born and a friend of nobles, but his work hastened the rise of democracy. Here in Geneva, Calvin perfected a church government of laymen and ministers called presbyters, from the Greek word for elder. Despite criticisms, Calvin retained a lively wit. According to one story, a heckler asked him, "If you know so much, tell us what God was doing before he created the earth." Calvin replied, he was making hell for over-curious men.
Sick
Okay.
burn.
Charbroiled.
So
Even mainline Presbyterians could make jokes about that. Wow.
so yeah, that's you know, I think humor, especially something bordering on ridicule or a snark, is probably, well, I know it's not well regarded in pious conservative Presbyterian circles. I'd love to be able to do a show someday and make a case for the validity of snark and humor and all the stuff we like to do. But maybe that would be self-serving. But do you think there is a case, Dr. Hart, historically? A lot of our thin-skinned, weepy, I'll say opponents, people that would who might seem more pietistic. I don't think they could have lived through the Reformation times. I mean, it was rough, wasn't it? I mean, it was verbally and sometimes physically rough.
Exactly. And that keeps going even into the 18th century with revivalism. Uh, the anti and pro revivalists, each side could dish it out. Um, and even into the 19th century, someone like Charles Hodge was not as snarky as, say, Calvin could be, or the polemics of the 16th century could be, but still, there was a real bite to what Presbyterians and their critics were saying about each other. So it's a very different landscape, and people just accepted that this was part of the intellectual exchange.
Well,
Yeah,
I think it goes against the whole kind of stereotype that, in like Luther is the heart and Calvin is the mind, is like even within the first couple chapters of the Institutes, it's quite apparent that Calvin is just as talented linguistically and snarkily as Luther, with the way that he refers to um, I he calls some. I'm trying to think of what he calls somebody, like either like a rapscallion or a rabble rouser, pretty early on. But I mean, the snark is very much there, and you can kind of tell that he's sort of holding back in the Institutes a little bit. So I think it's a good thing for all involved to understand that Calvin was not this, stiff sort of, dare I say it, Dr. Fauci type, who couldn't take a joke. It's quite obvious that he was dispensing burn sauce on pretty much everybody.
well, now he felt bad about it more often than Luther did, probably. Luther had gotten all of his self-flagellation out back in the monk days, so
Oh.
I'm sure there was some guilt and regret with Calvin. Now,
What if Calvin wasn't trying to be funny? What if he was actually serious?
well,
I mean, I think there's something to that he felt that believed that he was right. The other people were wrong, and therefore they were. bad.
Yeah, well, could be. That too is not a popular. We're always supposed to doubt that sort of thing today. All right, well, so something we passed there and didn't mention. It said that Calvin was never ordained, but our friend WCF Lennox, he takes some issue with that, says he may well have been ordained. So if he wasn't ordained, he's got something in common with what? Charles Spurgeon and Mark Driscoll. So there, so that's a bulletin right there. So yeah, they did throw in that he wasn't ordained, and maybe that was an egalitarian sort of everybody can do it sort of remark. Well, let's proceed.
Thanks to Calvin, the Presbyterian Church is composed in equal parts of ardor and order. That is, ardor for things of the Spirit and order for the things of society.
Okay, now
Wow.
here's I think this is fairly novel. So, Dr. Hart, you've read lots of literature. Have you ever heard the ardor order dichotomy before?
Well, not in those terms, which is
Yeah.
actually it's rhetorically it's pretty good. But
it's
typically-
hard to say those words, though. It's kind of hard to distinguish those words.
right. But it's typically heart and mind, and typically it is spirit, but not society. It's usually
Right.
theology.
Well, I mean, for the past 100 years, though, it has been. So they're engaging in some anachronism there. And of course, they say, well, Calvin practically ran Geneva. He didn't want to. You can caricature Calvin as a civic politician and micromanager and enlightened city manager, but I don't think it's quite that simple, is it?
No, but the other oddity of that contrast is, if you think about order, you're thinking usually in conservative terms. How do you preserve social order? And Chortles is, if you're right, which you are, about some of the crazy stuff the PCUSA was doing in the 60s with either reformist or radical politics, depending on how you want to describe it, that would not be on the side of some kind of social order. It was more on the side of remaking things, redrawing lines, maybe even overturning things in order to set up something new. But that's not typically what people who are on the side of order do. So it's a strange contrast in that, and it suggests to me a kind of lack of intellectual precision in the people who were drawing this up.
We're going to hear it a number of times, so I won't back it up, but we're going to, old Frank is going to point out ardor and order several times.
Yeah, I think if you're going to make a drinking game on how many times he mentions that, I think that you're going to be in trouble by the end of this movie.
Well, a lot of our listeners just drink lemonade, though. Or
You're still going to the bathroom a lot.
okay, or seltzer. So here we go. Listen for ardor and order, and think about the emphases of the main line at this time.
That's the tension of the Calvinistic life.
All right, we should say the church here, which I do believe to be the National Presbyterian Church in D.C. It looks like that bizarre Roman Catholic church in France that looks like something out of Mordor. Now this is lighter and airier, but it does have a sort of space age. I don't know what would you call that, Resby? It's not brutalism, but it's certainly
It's close.
It's
yeah,
almost it's got a real Denethor Steward of Gondor vibe to it.
there you go. That's closer to it. Yeah, and
Like if I was gonna burn my son still alive and myself on a funeral pyre, this is the room I would do it in.
yeah, it would be yeah, but good for that. So here we go.
But Calvin stood for both poles of the church, ardor and order. He
Ding.
symbolized ardor in his crest, the
Ding.
flaming heart in an open hand, offered to God. His form of government stood just as firmly for order. Out of this tension came the mightiest streams of Presbyterianism. The English Puritans, who were people of ardor, the Scottish churchmen, who were people of order.
All right. What?
Jeez. Jeez.
What do we think of that? I mean, not all the Puritans were Calvinists. Let's get that out there. Or they wouldn't.
And
they
not all
wouldn't
the
have identified.
Puritans were Presbyterians, although a number were. You know, I'm not sure how the English or the Scots would particularly like that, but I mean, I'm too close to it, and I'm writing about some of this now. But when you look at the Bishops' War in Scotland, that really started the civil wars of the 1640s, and it's a war. The Bishops' War starts over Charles I and Laud imposing a Book of Common Prayer on the Presbyterians in Scotland, or the Scottish Church. Of course, there was much more going on than just liturgy, but the Covenanters were not exactly people. I mean, they were people of order of a kind, but they were willing to bear arms over this, which is another kind of Scottish meme or trope. So it's a really peculiar way of rendering the Scots, it seems to me. It just whitewashes 16th and 17th century Scottish history and the antagonism with the crown, whether the Scottish crown originally or then the crown of both England and Scotland once James I ascends to the throne in England. But I think this is a habit. This is a tick of American Presbyterians. They sort of want to claim some kind of rootage in Western history, in the Scots, in Geneva, but then they kind of brush away, they airbrush out the unsavory bits. And American Presbyterianism is much more vanilla than I think what happened in Scotland or Ireland or England.
All right. Well, our friend and former PCUSA teaching elder minister Chris Drew, now in the only pure church, the OPC, he confirms this is the setting for this documentary is the National Presbyterian Church in D.C. It is the church that sued the PCA at its founding to change its name. And he says it looks just the same today. Wow. So that would be an interesting visit. So let's roll on with Frank.
Calvin passed the baton to his disciple, John Knox, under whose leadership the Church of Scotland was born. Most remember Knox for his opposition to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her Catholic court. At stake was the religious and political life of the nation. Unfortunately, Mary lost her head. Knox kept his and built the Presbyterian system right into the blood and bone of Scotland.
All right, so there we go. So it occurs to me, Dr. Hart, you're a splitter, not a lumper, in historian terms.
Yes.
But apparently, if you're writing a documentary script, you have to make it all neatly. You have to have these neat cleavages like ardor and order, and you have to focus on the simple things like Mary Queen of Scots losing her head. There's not a lot of room for subtlety here. I assume you're noting a certain lack of subtlety and nuance in this presentation.
Right, but it's done, I think, so far, especially with the head references, trying to be clever and not trying to have an edge, which, it does also make you wonder, though, about people making light, in a way, of the death of a person. I mean, Yeah, I guess we do it all the time, but the PCUSA at this point, I would have thought was much more buttoned down, and they might be a little bit more respectful in the way that they rendered Mary's death. But
Yeah,
it's kind of a good line
yeah,
if you're
but
writing
not very feminist.
right. Well, no,
Because I think some of the revisionist films about Mary Queen of Scots have been sort of feminist. They portrayed her as a victim in some ways, which I'm sure she was. But yeah, that's a good point.
Did anyone here watch the movie? I mean, it was
Oh,
about Mary Queen of Scots.
all right, you dropped out. What was the movie was called? What?
Well, the film was about Mary Queen of Scots, but it had David Tennant as
Yes.
John Knox.
Yes, and he was a total caricature. I mean, he was a raving madman. But he did look like Knox. That was kind of he actually looked like Calvin, but certainly had the wardrobe and the beard down. Although it could have been a prosthetic beard. I don't know. So let's proceed. We're in Scotland.
It remains the official church today. For example, when Queen Elizabeth visits Scotland, she becomes a Presbyterian during her stay. And all Presbyterians, American, English, Welsh, German, Hungarian, Dutch, feel as though they are coming home when they visit Edinburgh.
Do they?
When I visit Pittsburgh, I become a caveman.
One great
Well, now Pittsburgh is or used to be a very Presbyterian city. But yeah, so interestingly, if you go to St. Giles Cathedral on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh today, Knox's grave is under like parking space 23. If there's not a car parked there, you can see a little marker on the ground. And they make much more of Jenny Geddes than they do of Knox. Now there is a fairly unimpressive statue of Knox there, but St. Giles is pretty woke, and they don't have a whole lot of time for John Knox. But you go down the street about a quarter mile, and you can go to his house. But if you go and if you tour the home of John Knox, they've turned it into a multicultural thing because guess what? A Jewish goldsmith lived there at one time. So they make much of all the different sort of people who lived in this house, which is fine. We're all in favor of Jewish merchants. So we're not that kind of podcast. All right, so back to Edinburgh.
home when they visit Edinburgh. One great event for Presbyterians was the emigration of Scotsmen to Northern Ireland. Persecuted for their faith, they poured over to Ulster by the thousands and set up strong centers of Presbyterianism.
All right, now that's a special interest of yours, Dr. Hart. You go to Northern Ireland almost yearly lately, and for some reason, you've developed an affinity to those oddballs over there in Northern Ireland.
Well, again, talk about whitewashing history. I mean, this is a kind of colonialism going on with the transplantation of Scots into Ireland. It was one of the many attempts by the English monarchs to try to subdue Ireland. So again, the political wariness, the political challenges, and the troubles are going on right then when they're making this movie, and they don't seem to be aware that they may need to be, well, maybe this was a little bit more uncomfortable than we're making it seem, but this is some sort of great projection of Scottish Presbyterianism into Ireland. And the Irish, I mean, to this film's credit so far, to talk about the Irish contribution to American Presbyterianism, or the Welsh or the English, is actually much better than sort of talking about a straight line from Scotland to America. But on the other hand, what transpired with the settling of Protestants in Ireland was by no means a an easy historical moment.
All right, let's continue.
Later, these people, the so-called Scotch-Irish, came to America in huge waves, and they brought their orderly church with them.
Now, is that true? Because the Ulstermen, the Scotch-Irish, they pretty much settled the Appalachians, and they may have had such a church in maybe Pittsburgh, but as they moved down the Appalachians into Western Carolina, what would become Tennessee, most of them became Baptist at some point. There are very few Presbyterians in many parts of the Appalachians, so that's slightly romanticized in pressing the order part. Although the early Presbyterians were pretty serious, and he's going to talk a good bit about Francis McAmey, I think. But just
Right.
have to throw that in. Have to speak up for my neighbors, the Scotch-Irish.
Neither English nor Scottish were the first Presbyterians to hit the shores of America, however. That honor belonged to the French reformers, often called Huguenots, who came to St. Augustine in 1562 with a Master Robin, their preacher. Robin and his parishioners might have had second thoughts about this honor because the Spanish wiped them out to a man.
That's a dark turn there, and they have
I was
they
just
have
about
picked
to say that edit.
they have quick edit, quick cut, jump cut edits of dismembered heads here, which is where we have the movie stop now. So
And
I didn't know about that, but we did do a show on the Huguenot pirates of the Caribbean. So the pirates of the Caribbean were actually mostly French Calvinists. Just throwing that in.
well, it is I didn't know about this part of Presbyterian history, and I'd like to know more about it now. Presbyterian, it really was, but it's curious to take these big sweeping claims at some points and then go into a detail like this and include this in a 28-minute film. It's hard to fathom exactly how they're calculating what to include and what to leave on the cutting floor.
Well, I have a theory. It's a visual medium, and if you have some good pictures, you try to
Yeah.
use them because
Yeah.
they have no footage. I mean, there's no film, so they do a fairly dramatic edit here, which is very
What if that was the point of this
1970s.
edit? To make it sort of like a flip book. So if you just do it really fast, it's like all one. It's just one big death montage.
And let's
Yes.
be honest. I mean, this movie needs all the spiciness it can get, right?
Yes, yeah. I backed it up a bit, so we'll see this edit again when all the beheadings and such.
And his parishioners might have had second thoughts about this honor because the Spanish wiped them out to a man.
So Presbyterians were just Aztecs, basically. The
During that
Spanish
same
wiped them out,
period,
too.
30,000 of these Calvinists were killed in the St. Bartholomew massacre.
Man, they're really writing this.
Now,
Jeez.
more heads. Yes.
Meanwhile,
The ambient
All right, so
screams. That actually
Yeah.
was not Mrs. Resby.
Yeah, it's yeah, that's it's quite the thing. So, we've never done a show about the Huguenots. We'd like to. I guess the Huguenot pirates of the Caribbean was the closest that we've come. But it's good that they mentioned that,
It
and
is.
they weren't downplaying the genocidal fury of the French Catholics against these French Calvinists.
But it does allow to establish the narrative, as we now call them. They started with Calvin, and they underscored democracy. Calvin was about
Right.
democracy, and now you have possible rebellion, but rebellion against tyranny for the sake of liberty going on with these events. So Presbyterians are going to be on the side of liberty and willing to risk their lives for it.
Yeah, at this time, Roman Catholics would have not have been viewed very positively. This is pre John Paul the second or whatever, the Polish Pope. He sort of made Catholicism cool, but Catholicism would not have been regarded for its love of liberty at this time. I guess the liberation theology in Central America and South America maybe was not quite as trendy then as it was in the early 80s, just 10 years later. So, all right, let's proceed.
Killed in the St. Bartholomew Massacre. Meanwhile, in England, the Puritans, who were also Calvinists, took over the English government, beheaded the king, and called together the famous Westminster Divines.
Okay, more heads. This is a beheading movie, pretty much.
Well, remember, Calvin is the head of the Reformation.
That's right. Yes, the orderly head, and yeah. Watch out for that order. So here we are, the famous picture, the Westminster Divines in the Jerusalem chamber, adjacent to the House of Parliament. But here we go.
They may have gotten the chronology there a little bit correctly, because they announced Charles I's beheading and then the Westminster Divines, but it's actually the reverse. And the Divines were meeting during the war that leads to Charles' execution. And I think I sometimes, when I teach Sunday school or whatever, I try to remember to spice up the shorter catechism, that the shorter catechism, the first question and answer that we love, that many Presbyterians love anyway, leads to the execution of a king, and not the other way around.
Who's the guy on the right that looks like Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull? That's what I want to know.
I've got a high-res version of this picture, and there are some interesting characters in this, and there's some real dandies. There's some really some brightly colored clothing, which I wouldn't be comfortable wearing, although Carl Truman and Chad Van Dixhorn would feel comfortable in some of these things. So, here we go. We're in Westminster.
These learned gentlemen, joined by Scottish Presbyterians, produced a major standard of the Church, the Westminster Confession of Faith. From the shorter catechism came the famous question, what is the chief end of man?
There it is.
Answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Through the 1600s, most Presbyterians settled heavily in the middle colonies in America, from New York to Maryland, or down south through the Great Valley of Virginia and on into the Carolinas. A famous missionary of that era was Francis McKimmey, a Scotsman born in Ireland. At one point, he was thrown in prison for preaching in New York without a license.
Okay, so New York has always been terrible, as you've many times told us, Doctor, for the Presbyterians. So, anything you want to say about New Amsterdam?
Well, I think what I'll just say briefly about this is that McKimmey is how I pronounce it. Frank, though, could be correct. This is another famous incident that American Presbyterians have told themselves to vindicate the church's commitment to religious liberty and political liberty, because McKimmey was in prison for preaching without a license, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, it's a big chapter in the narrative of Presbyterians and modern politics.
All right, so Presbyterians always on the side of the good guys.
Yes.
The governor made McKimmey pay a huge fine. As a result, the colonies rallied to the Presbyterian call for religious toleration. Even the famous Mathers of New England, Increase, and Cotton found McKimmey a voice to their liking. So
Wow.
did 6 other Presbyterians who in 1706 elected McKimmey moderator of the first American Presbytery, which was held in Philadelphia. Of these 7, about half were English Puritans with their zeal for ardor. The other half were Scotch-Irish with their equal zeal for order.
Okay, so we're staying on this theme. We're gonna ride this horse down all the way.
It's only 28 minutes, so you could do it. If it were an hour and 28, you might have to change up. But
Yeah, but we're barely a third of the way through.
I know.
So we'll try to let it run. But we this is this show, this podcast is edifitainment or infotainment more likely. So we want to give information, but we want to be entertaining, and we're probably going to err on the side of the tainment here. But,
1706 in Philadelphia. Isn't that the year they opened the first Wawa?
Well, that's when they invented the cheesesteak, though. Probably. All right.
By 1717, the little presbytery had grown to 4 in Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New York. And the collection of presbyteries became the first synod. This period from 1717 to 1776 was a fabulous one for both education and evangelism. The Log College of William Tennant educated able ministers, and its graduates started a tradition of building colleges side by side with churches. Its influence contributed to the forming of the institution that later became Princeton University. Today, the Presbyterian Church can look back to a host of colleges and seminaries founded by missionaries.
All right. So that's something that Presbyterians pride themselves on. Any comment on that, Doctor?
Well, democracy, liberty, and now education. The package is growing, and Presbyterians are looking very mainstream in a good way. I mean, I would say there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Those are all good things to identify with in the American political and cultural tradition, although the degree to which Presbyterians are responsible for some of that is a question, and the degree to which Presbyterians should be involved in politics is also another question. But in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, when you have religious establishments, church establishments, you can't help but be involved in politics in some way. But that changes, obviously, with the American Revolution. Don't want to get ahead of Frank here, though.
All right.
This Great Awakening was more than a revival, it was a national seizure. Leading the way was young Jonathan Edwards, one of the ablest theologians America has ever produced. He insisted that 2 things were necessary parts of conversion.
Order
1,
and order.
The affections of the heart had to be powerfully moved. And 2, the daily actions of the Christian had to be reflections of Christ. Again, ardor and order.
See?
As a result, about 1/6 of the nation was converted, and new compassion was manifested toward Indians and Negroes.
Okay. So did Edwards ever sell his slaves? I've heard not, but
Yeah.
maybe you know.
I don't know.
So they're basically saying that the social programs of the 20th century Presbyterian Church Northern were all anticipated by a non-Presbyterian in the 1700s.
Well, Frank looked a little uncomfortable when he talked about natives and Negroes, though. He did. He
didn't say natives.
he said Indians. Yes, I think that's right. So
well,
yeah,
I'm sorry. I'm still going with the preferred term, dude.
Well, we always encourage the parlance of our times on the Presbycast. All right, here we go. Let's see. Frank does seem a little skeptical, but let's give him a chance to recover this one.
The Revolutionary War record of the Presbyterian Church was dazzling. By that time, neither New England's Congregationists nor the Scotch-Irish had much use for the crown. In fact, Presbyterian ministers were so outspoken that one member of Parliament in London spoke of the American Revolution as the Presbyterian Rebellion.
All right. My take on that has always been that they were comparing the Americans to the Parliament at the time of the writing of the Westminster Confession
Yeah.
and some Presbyterians who were involved in the English Civil War. I don't think he was referring to the polity and organization of the church in America at that time. I think Presbyterian was shorthand for anti-royalist based on things that happened probably in the late 17th century in England. Am I right or wrong about that?
No, I think that's right. I think that's
Yeah.
even going back to the 1640s.
Right.
Just parenthetically, though, I don't know if you caught it, but it sounded like Frank said congregationists,
Yes, he did.
not,
Yes, I noticed that the first time I listened to it.
which
So,
is actually they probably wrote the people who wrote the script probably wrote congregationalists because they would be much more aware of the different denominations. But Frank himself may not have been that aware, so he just went with the copy that he thought he saw and came up with something I've never heard before, which is congregationists.
but we could start. We could make that term great again. So, all right. Well, yeah, I did notice that. And,
Creationist.
yeah. Yep. Here we go.
The only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence and the only clerical member of the Continental Congress was the Reverend John Witherspoon, who thundered from his pulpit, "There is not a single instance in history in which civil liberties were lost and religious liberty preserved." After the war, the American government was similar
Yeah,
to
but what if there's a
Presbyterian
virus, dude?
Americans rejected both a king to rule from the top and a pure democracy to rule from the bottom for a republic in between. Presbyterians rejected both bishops to rule from the top and congregations to rule from the bottom for a presbytery in between.
That's
Now
actually a
let's
good
rid our
point.
Yes. Yeah. It is. And going back to Witherspoon, I mean, he did sound a little bit like a Machenite libertarian, although I'm not sure there were such things back then. I guess arguably Jefferson had some tendencies in that direction, but that is a good point, and I think that's fairly helpful. Most of this is pretty straight, but it is a 28-minute package, and we'll see where we go.
The bottom for a presbytery in between. Now let's grit our teeth, pull down the chart, and look at the 4 levels of Presbyterian church government.
All right, so he's talking about the 4 levels because the old Northern Church was large enough that it had synods, which is an intermediary court between presbyteries and the General Assembly. But that's what we're going to hear about here. So some people may want to make synods great again, but let's see what Frank says.
First, the local congregation, which is the real authority in the church. It all starts right here. Second, presbytery. The presbytery ordains clergy, reviews church activities, and so on. Third, the synod. It reviews the work of presbytery. Fourth, the General Assembly. This is something like the White House, the Supreme Court, and Congress all in one.
All right, so we're looking at footage from probably the late 60s of a UPC, USA, UPC, NA, or USA, whatever they were called at that time, General Assembly, and it's being held in what's obviously a basketball or a hockey arena. It's a big meeting, and there are banners in the background that say world peace and unity of all people. So they were woke before woke was cool. And if you notice the images they were flashing when they were talking about the various level, the presbytery and the local church, they were pushing the diversity angle really hard, I think. And you see it here too. But it's interesting that they said, it all starts. The basic element of government is the local church. He didn't mention that if you try to pull out of those churches, the mainline churches, the Presbyterian churches, southern and northern of that day, you couldn't take your property with you. If you tried to leave the communion, the presbytery suddenly owned your property, and you had to pay a ransom to get out, if they would even let you do that. So this is a sunny picture of local churches, freedom, and their place in all this, and it was not good. And those who formed the OPC suffered from this. Those who formed the PCA certainly suffered in loss of property and monies. And even the EPC and ECO to this day are still fighting with the mainline church over their property. So have to interject that. All is not so rosy. Here we go.
Its pronouncements on social affairs, war, poverty, race, etc., are not binding on congregations, but carry great weight.
All right, so there's the tip of the hat to the social issue, position paper, religion, mostly driven by central committees and denominational offices that typified what was going on in the Northern and the Southern Church, the the PCUS, and the two Northern bodies before they joined together. And we see this today, I think, arguably in the PCA, with our study committees and our social pronouncements, some of which are fine and good, but I'm a little worried at the number of social emphases and study committees that we seem to have in the PCA. It's reminiscent to me of the mainline church, but not everyone agrees. Do you have an opinion on that, Doctor?
No, I think it is reminiscent of that. It doesn't seem the PCA has the same kind of structural heft that the mainline churches did by virtue of almost at least 80 years of that kind of growth. If look at the PCA in 50 years, it may achieve that, although you'd have to be pretty big to do that. But I think there are a lot of similarities in that regard. And it's ironic because that was the environment out of which the PCA came to leave that sort of church life.
Yeah, let me back it up so we can hear sort of the equation of the General Assembly with a political convention almost, or a social work get-together.
The presbytery ordains clergy, reviews church activities, and so on. Third, the synod. It reviews the work of presbytery. Fourth, the General Assembly. This is something like the White House, the Supreme Court, and Congress all in one. Its pronouncements on social affairs, war, poverty, race, etc., are not binding on congregations, but carry great weight. Compared with the number of Methodists or Baptists, Presbyterians are small potatoes. Right after the American Revolution, the Presbyterian Church was one of the 4 largest and the most evenly distributed church in America. That was not to last long for 2 reasons. First, the Presbyterians, unlike the Methodists or the Baptists, were unwilling to send uneducated men to the western frontiers of Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Mississippi Valley. People were crying for a few gospel crumbs of bread, but Presbyterians in the East said, wait for the whole loaf or starve.
All right. Well, that sounds like something a broadening church would say, and they sound slightly embarrassed of their past, even as they try to extol their great learning. That's accurate as far as it goes. The Presbyterians couldn't expand on the frontier so quickly because they just couldn't train ministers so quickly, and they couldn't just recruit at every third cabin like the Baptists did and make someone a preacher. But what's your take on the script's description of these Second Great Awakening frontier days?
Well, the main point is correct that the Presbyterians couldn't keep up because of the demand for an educated ministry. And if you think about well-educated men going out to the frontier and trying to work with recently settled, sometimes immigrants. It's a bit of a stretch to think that that's going to be the way you want to plant churches, even though it's not just the Reformation. I mean, historically, ever since Constantine, in effect, the church has emphasized a kind of learned ministry of some kind. The Baptists and Methodists were novel in thinking that wasn't as important. But it's a striking way of putting it in the script that either you get the whole thing or you die. So I guess the script writers had a little bit of a score to settle with someone on that front. I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Maybe let's see if the next couple of minutes shed any light on this.
Naturally, the settlers joined churches that gave them the gospel, with or without a seminary degree. Whole congregations of Presbyterians became Methodists, Baptists, Cumberland Presbyterians, or joined other denominations. And there were individual missionaries of extraordinary power. One was a man named Worcester, who stood by the Cherokees during their pitiful fight for their homes and their subsequent dispossession. Worcester, who translated the Bible into Sequoia and edited the Cherokee Journal, was imprisoned as a troublemaker by the state of Georgia. Worcester's case went to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Marshall sent back a ruling in his favor. The governor of Georgia replied to Marshall, "If you want Worcester, come and get him." Finally freed, he went on the 1,000-mile Trail of Tears and ministered to the Cherokees in Oklahoma for the rest of his life.
All right, so were you aware of that figure?
Not
Doctor?
really. Not
So
really.
he is. I mean, that's a very late '60s, early '70s sort of social issue, and it's obvious why they included that. I gather he was Presbyterian, although I think he's held out as an example, as an exception, maybe to the rule for Presbyterians in those days. So, Brother Worcester, whoever he was.
Like most periods in church history, the time from 1800 to 1860 was filled with noisy issues and quiet ones. The quiet ones, a working partnership with the Congregationalist Church. Things were so close for a while that the pastor of a Presbyterian and Congregationalist church could serve in each other's pulpit. They were nicknamed Presbygationalists. The benevolent empire, so called because private individuals across church lines began crusading and organizing for moral reform and against intemperance, slavery, and war.
All right. Anything to add there? So, I mean, they're dispensing with the new school, old school, new light, old light. We're not going to hear anything about that. But they're pushing the social aspect of the churches, and there's nothing they didn't portray the union, the near union of some Presbyterians and the Congregationalists in a negative light at all here.
Right. Yeah, it's again, it's the large theme is the church serving the nation, which is a very common theme throughout Presbyterian history during this period. And it's so strikingly different from a church that in the 60s begins to show itself to be in some ways very critical of America and even bordering on anti-American, which will be much more common after this film is made in the last decades of the 20th century. And I couldn't help but also notice the use of the word crusading. Crusade is not necessarily a great word. Wheaton College actually has to change its mascot from Crusader to Thunder because of the challenges of that word. And yet here it's, as was common at the time, using it freely and in a positive way. A crusade is a good thing.
So Wheaton's going to become the Thunderers.
Yeah. It's
That's
been that
gonna-
way for about a decade now.
Okay, that makes the athletic cheers a little difficult, although I don't know if they have athletics at Wheaton.
They do. Yeah.
Okay. All right, here we go. So someone wisely points out that this guy looks a little bit like Anderson Cooper
Exactly.
as well. I hadn't thought about that. I don't think about Anderson very much.
Then there were foreign missions. Up to this time, America had been a mission field itself for Europe, especially England or Scotland. Now the American board, formed mostly with Congregationalists and Presbyterians, sent its first missionaries to India, men and women named Judson, Rice, Newell, Holt, and Hall. And the final quiet issue, home missions. Again, Congregationalists and Presbyterians led the way by starting the American Home Missionary Society, which sent money and ministers to churches all over the South and West. Paid only a pittance, missionaries like Hall and Chapman planted churches and schools in Ohio, the Indiana and Illinois territories, and throughout the Mississippi Valley. By 1835, Dr. Marcus Whitman, a New York physician, had reached Oregon, his wife and those of other missionaries being the first white women to cross the Rockies. These were the quiet issues: union, missions, education. But the noisy ones got all the attention. First, there was the split in the church between the new ways and the old ways.
Oh, there we
This
go.
time it was ardor versus order. The leaders of the ardent wing wanted to evangelize the frontiers and change anything that got in the way of their mission. But the leaders of the orderly wing disliked the evangelical spirit because it got in the way of sound theology. They wanted to change nothing.
All right. So, change nothing. It could be true. There's Calvin's famous deathbed quote. He says, basically, don't change anything because it's dangerous. But is this a fair? Is he talking about the old light, new light, or old school, new school here?
Old school, new school, likely. Right. And I mean, in a 10-second soundbite, it's overstated, but it's somewhat accurate. It keeps the story moving.
Well, I'm just going to call you Mr. Order from now on. But here we go.
Things got so hot, the church burst its seams. And for years, there were 2 Presbyterian denominations. That was bad enough. But the worst was yet to come: slavery. In 1818, the General Assembly said, "We consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another totally irreconcilable with the gospel of Jesus Christ." Unfortunately, the cotton gin spoke louder than Christ, and Presbyterians said in 1836, resolved that this whole subject be indefinitely postponed. But it would not go away, and soon Presbyterians, like other Christians, were killing each other in the Civil War. The tragedy is that after the war, the nation reunited, but not the Presbyterians.
Okay, now we have a scene shift to the Presbyterian Historical Society offices in Philadelphia, and those probably still exist.
They do, yeah.
So this was...
From the Civil War on, we focus our attention on that branch called the Presbyterian Church in the USA, which is now the United Presbyterian Church. There were other large Presbyterian bodies, such as the descendants of Scottish Covenanters and Seceders, who merged their splendid heritages in the United Presbyterian Church of North America in 1858. Meanwhile, there was the far west, still untamed, and gold was in the air.
Banjo.
Back east, the United States was growing into a nation of cities overnight. At first, most Presbyterians were unsympathetic toward labor, but increasingly, the General Assembly began to take their side in the battle for wages and housing.
Kind of like with Deacon's
It
light
was
bulbs.
here at New York's Labor Temple that Presbyterians became the helpers of the helpless.
All right, so the Labor Temple. I don't know. That's we got some real progressivism going on here, and we got these city Presbyterians that we've heard so much about.
But
So-
just before we get too far away from it, notice how much space slavery took up, which is to say very little
Right.
in this movie. Living as we do now, post 1619 Project, and being hit over the head as we are about how systemic racism is in the country and has always been, you can't imagine in some way then an institution more naive about slavery or racism and using this movie as an example to show that. I mean, they thought they were on the right side of what occurred in the 19th century, but it's like, okay, it's all over, and now we're going forward, and race is going to come up here in a few minutes in other ways, but it's still extraordinary how much of America, even Northerners, thought that the issue was largely settled, the country had moved on.
All right. So now they're into the progressive era, and they're talking about labor and urban conditions.
Neighborhood houses, many starting in Chicago, spread into every city. By 1900, national agencies had sprung up to combat poverty, war, and alcoholism. Meanwhile, both home and foreign missions were gathering steam. When the railroad spike of gold was pounded into the intercontinental hookup, Sheldon Jackson and his band of national missionaries spread westward, planting churches and building schools, especially schools for Indians and hospitals for all. One of the great missions was to the Chinese in California. Leading the way was a woman, Donaldina Cameron, who rescued Chinese girls from white slavers and established the Great Cameron House. Amanda McFarland served first in New Mexico, then in Alaska, where she founded what became Jackson College.
Hey, Chortles.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Have you noticed when they start talking about the Chinese as a group, they start playing that traditional pipa and zang music? Where was the polka music when they were talking about Martin Luther? That's what I want to know.
I don't know. That's shorthand. It is sort of stereotypical. I don't. That's. I noticed that as well. But we have to maintain a sort of sense of humor on these things. So you're being microaggressed through all this because of your rich ethnic heritage. Yes.
But also notice, I mean, to sort of repeat myself from the last time I was talking, but I was recently reading stories about statue of Sheldon Jackson, the missionary mentioned there, and I think it's on Whitman College campus, where the students want the statue to be removed. PCUSA in the 1970s thought that these missionaries to either natives or Chinese or other people, non-European peoples, they thought they were progressive. They thought they were going in the right direction. And lo and behold, 50, 60 years later, what were we doing? Now this all looks like white supremacy, which is perhaps a warning to those people who today think they've got it right. In 50 years, you may actually have some egg on your face if you're still living, or you may want your descendants to try to do some explaining for you. But it's really hard to get on the right side of history.
Nah, we got it right this time. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, true Presbyterianism has never been tried, so we're entering a golden age. I was going back and forth with someone today on the whole revoice thing, and what I wanted to say, but I didn't, was that how is it that in this time of towering intellects and societal peace and tranquility, that we think we've discovered something that eluded the church for 2,000 years. That's
Right.
we always think we figured it out, but even these mainliners had not figured it out in 1974.
In 1870, the Women's Foreign Mission Society was formed. They had a large part in sending missionaries across the world, people like Helen Reischauer, who started the first school for the deaf and dumb in Japan. From Sheldon Jackson, who finally made it to Alaska, to
Wow.
Ralph Hall with his early campfire meetings, to Dr. Dorothy Ferris, medical missionary to Japan, the church stayed on the mission move. Missionary Jackson became the first commissioner of education in the Alaska Territory. People who try to make audio-visual histories are especially grateful to him because he was a camera bug.
That slow William Tell overture is killing me.
Overseas, the church sent missionaries to 21 countries and areas of the world, largely in the Cameroon, Brazil, Cuba, India, Iran, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Pakistan, Syria, and the Philippines.
I like how they're showing them going over into foreign missions, and the second commandment violation. They're promoting a white Jesus to in the foreign fields.
Well, he still was back then. Yeah. Let me just interject here because they had pictures of Japanese Christians, and I think the American missionaries have always had an especially hard way to go in Japan. We used to have someone who followed us, and his Twitter handle was like the only Presbyterian in Japan or something like that. But I was listening to the latest installment in Dan Carlin's, 6-part, 5 hours each series on, it's called Supernova in the East. It's about the Japanese and their colonial run up to World War II and all the way to the end of the war. And he made the point that he said there were a number of Christian Japanese who fought for the Japanese Army and Navy, and that actually some of the kamikaze pilots were Christian, and they had their Bibles with them when they were slamming into American ships. So I guess by that measure, something didn't work out. Something didn't turn out too terribly well with this missionary activity. But we're not up to the 30s yet. But we should note that even here, they're equating mission with social work, and that was really the sort of the formal cause of Machen's problems, opposing the foreign missionaries who were not at all worried about the gospel, but who were worried about practically everything else. So let's proceed with it in this golden age.
One of the most successful missions was that of the United Presbyterian Church of North America in Egypt, which began back in the 1850s and pioneered its way into self-support. Davida Finney began the literacy and literature program in Egypt, which thrives today. Much of this came under the leadership of a layman, Dr. Robert E. Spear.
All right, so he's one of Machen's nemesis,
Yes.
Robert Spear, manly man, former athlete, as I recall,
Yes.
forceful speaker, a very positive and 100% American and all that stuff. But I didn't know that there were Presbyterian missionaries in Egypt. But again, they're talking about the institutions that they're extolling are something for literacy and literature. It was cultural imperialism, really,
It
We were trying
was.
we were
It
trying to
was.
pacify the world, and our idea of Christianizing them was making them American.
Or at least Western.
Right.
And there's no sense in this movie that that's a problem at this point in 1974.
Yep. Well, let's proceed. And there's old Dr. Spear.
Perhaps this man is the church's leading symbol of education.
Yowza.
Before he was a politician and a president, he was a teacher at Princeton and a very gifted lay preacher. Following the Civil War,
Oh, well, that was Woodrow Wilson, we should say.
By the way, I've sat in the chair right there where Frank is sitting. I've used that library.
That's in Princeton?
No, that's the Philadelphia
Oh,
Presbyterian
okay.
Society in Philadelphia.
All right. So Woodrow Wilson, somebody whose family Machen socialized with, but Machen certainly did not see eye to eye with Wilson on either theological or political issues by the later years of his life. So good old Woodrow Wilson, who was said to have been a ruling elder in the Northern Church, although his family was Southern, and his views on race apparently were not too enlightened. That's correct?
Yes.
Right. All right. Good old Woodrow. Here we go.
this man is the church's leading symbol of education. Before he was a politician and a president, he was a teacher at Princeton and a very gifted lay preacher. Following the Civil War, the church had begun to teach its own through Sunday school classes for children, through Christian Endeavor and later Westminster Fellowships for students, and through communicants classes for new members. Then, as always, the most striking reminder of Calvin's scholarship was the emergence of new colleges. Theologically, the church went through the battles of modernism and fundamentalism. Again, the forces of ardor favored changes in the Westminster Confession to make the gospel more appealing, while the forces of order did not wish to abandon a single jot or tittle of orthodoxy.
So that's pretty much all they say about the Presbyterian controversy.
Right.
So that whole, 3 decade long battle is, he doesn't mention that they had already changed the confession and done some, I don't know what you call it, reductionism with the fundamentals. Sort of the Presbyterian fundamentals, not the fundamentalist fundamentals. But there was already reductionism going on. So those who eventually opposed the liberals had already seen a lot of, jots and tittles changed. So that's not entirely fair. So that was the whole account of the Presbyterian controversy.
But on no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, the period around which you spent much of your working life, it's dispensed with in about 8 seconds here, so no pressure.
But on the upside, he does say that those people didn't want to give up orthodoxy. So they were actually orthodox. They weren't crazy people. They weren't on the side of ardor, wanting to blow up the church to upset the peace and purity of the church, which is what modernists were always oftentimes accusing conservatives of doing. They weren't playing by the order of the church. He actually compliments them by saying they were orthodox. Who wouldn't want to be orthodox if you're in the Christian church? It's an odd turn of phrase there.
Yeah. Well, let's back it up a couple seconds. So that's so significant. I think we should hear that again.
And later Westminster Fellowships for students, and through communicants classes for new members. Then, as always, the most striking reminder of Calvin's scholarship was the emergence of new colleges. Theologically, the church went through the battles of modernism and fundamentalism. Again, the forces of ardor favored changes in the Westminster Confession to make the gospel more appealing, while the forces of order did not wish to abandon a single jot or tittle of orthodoxy. It was a fabulous era. Much to the disgust of church capitalists, the leading socialist was Presbyterian Norman Thomas. Balancing him, however, was the silver-tongued William Jennings Bryan. From World War I to World War II, a new wave of thought hit the church. Pastors and teachers rediscovered the Bible. The leader of this new kind of orthodoxy was the great Reformed theologian and pastor Karl Barth.
All right, so we moved pretty quickly there. They
Sure
said
did.
there was a Presbyterian who was a socialist, but then you also had William Jennings Bryan, the Scopes Monkey trial lawyer in Dayton, Tennessee, just south of here. Yeah, I think that's what they call a whipsaw in some circles.
Well,
When you
and it's not actually the case politically that William Jennings Bryan was balancing out the socialist. I mean, Bryan as a populist was probably closer in some ways to socialism. Not that he was a socialist in any way, but he would have been much more sympathetic. There's a kind of populism that goes in the bones of socialism as well. So it's a kind of odd way to pair those two.
So here, just a decade or two after the days of Machen, we're told that the Presbyterians rediscovered the Bible, and they came up with a new orthodoxy, neo-orthodoxy, Karl Barth. So here we are.
Meanwhile, between the wars and despite depression, Presbyterians continued to plant churches, schools, and hospitals. The ecumenical movement surged strong and wide as Christians made common cause with all their brothers around the world. The idea was simple. You can't be a good Presbyterian, or Methodist, or Catholic locally unless you are also a good Christian internationally.
So, you notice they were about planting churches and schools and colleges. So, I mean, and schools and hospitals. So that again is the modern mission and missionary movement that Machen was so opposed to. It's a totally different conception of mission, and we see this in the PCA today in some ways. The tension between just preach and redeeming the city, renewing the neighborhood, loving the city back to life. There are PCA churches that have basically started and bought and owned grocery stores in inner city neighborhoods, and that may be needful, but the question is it the work of the church? Those efforts have more in common with mid-century mainline than they do with what we're probably comfortable with. Any comments on that?
Well, I was just going to go off a little bit more of what he was saying there toward the end. I think what you were saying, Chortles, is right. But this idea that to be a Christian, you need to be a Christian internationally, which is a way that they try to represent the ecumenical movement. But they don't really come to terms with the earlier interpretation of the missions movement and the way in which they don't say it, but the way that the missionaries were trying to make other societies more Western. So there's a tension there, at least, between trying to be international and recognize the commonness of all people, while on the other hand, going around trying to get these people to be more Western, at least, to put it that way. So it's just another kind of odd little wrinkle in the mental framework of the people responsible for the movie.
Yeah, it's not really Matthew 25 when you get right down to it. They've upgraded.
From World War II till the 1970s, Presbyterians hustled into every area of national and international life.
Hustle.
At home, the mission stretched from rural Appalachia to southwestern health and welfare units. From ministry among and with blacks in the rural South to side-by-side brotherhood with minorities in the inner cities. From hundreds of new churches in suburbia to a new program of keeping the churches alive in the ghetto. From community organizations to drug clinics and legal aids for the poor and the crippled. Some of our films from that period in the 50s show united Presbyterian concern for the have-nots. Gripped by the imperative of Matthew 25, the General Assembly gathered a council of laymen and pastors, of theologians and social scientists, and of businessmen to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and visit the prisoners. Following World War II, the General Assembly took some strong stands. It advised the Supreme Court not to approve prayer in public schools. It recognized drugs and alcohol as symptoms of a disease to be attacked medically and with Christian understanding. But the most explosive issue for the 1960s, just as it was the most explosive issue for the 1860s, was race.
All right, so all things old are new again. That's certainly come around. But it's interesting that Machen, the libertarian, opposed prayer in schools, where the Presbyterians of his day were very much about Americanization and civic religion. So there's a place where, for completely different reasons, I would think, the liberalizing mainline began to oppose things like school prayer. But explain to us how their motives had to be different, or at least they got there in a different way than Machen would have in the 20s and 30s when he opposed such things.
Well, I'd actually like to see what the PCUSA or UPCUSA wrote about the Supreme Court decisions, because I know that even someone like Reinhold Niebuhr was not positive about removing prayer and Bible reading from public schools, and what this court did was declare this was unconstitutional. So was the church actually responding to a legal matter per se, or were they actually trying to say the church or the nation needed to be broader in some way? I don't know, but how they got there is more likely on the side of mainline Protestant discomfort with their understanding that they had been the beneficiary of certain kind of privileges in American society and wanting to extend those privileges to other people in America.
Right.
And to the glory of Presbyterians, they quarreled and debated, but did not split. When this man was arrested in Baltimore,
Dr. Eugene Carson Blake.
Yes.
and this man marched in Selma and witnessed on the scene in Mississippi, some cried that clergy should stay out of politics.
Not clear that these protests are actually politics, but
Right.
While others, both clergy and laymen, were proud to join in the crusade. What emerged was a two-legged gospel, the right leg of personal salvation and the left leg of community correction. Again, ardor and order.
Okay.
Hard to imagine a term like community correction getting much traction today.
Two legs of the gospel, mind you.
Yeah.
wait, so order goes with community correction and
I
ardor?
I really don't know. It's not altogether clear which is which. That's why it's not terribly helpful. Yeah,
But they've got a theme and they're going to stick with it.
that's right. Yep,
You
indeed.
have to admire the discipline.
Abroad, the Presbyterians continued to blaze trails. The day of sending missionaries to the heathen gave way to fraternal workers who helped various national churches establish themselves, their clergy, and their own missions. Long before the Peace Corps, Presbyterians were doing the same thing on a worldwide scale.
Take that,
The
Peace Corps.
overriding thought was this: the world mission is one mission on 6 continents, and all of us are missionaries to one another. And that goes at home, too. In 1958, 2 great
Fat trombone.
branches merged: the Presbyterian Church in the USA and the United Presbyterian Church of North America. The name adopted was the United Presbyterian Church in the
Background music is
USA.
straight out of like National Lampoon's Vacation.
So what they pictured here for our listener only people. Apparently they made banners each side, the 2 denominations, and they sort of met in the street. It looked like they were going to joust, but then they united and hugged.
Actually, to be clear, and this was also sort of striking about the image, it wasn't in the street; it was in the sidewalk.
Right?
And
Yes.
they didn't have to close the street down because most people didn't care. But they did have a cop there to make sure that they had free access to the sidewalk. But
All right. So this is the reunion of these 2 churches, the Northern Church that eventually joined with the PCUS to form the PCUSA. It couldn't be
again,
hard.
yeah.
Couldn't be much more confusing, but there was very little originality with these naming conventions. Just to mash it all up and do a word scramble. So here we go.
In education, Presbyterians hacked their way through the jungle of church school materials and produced the first graded curriculum for Protestants, one that gave the students textbooks and workbooks and learning materials, plus a high-protein diet of theology. No church can last long without its patriarchs. Here are a few of the great leaders.
I recognize very few, except I think Pearl Buck was in there. Was she
I
one
didn't
of those?
see her actually.
Well, anyway, it was just people that all Presbyterians were supposed to recognize, and I don't know who they were, but those
Right.
were the patriarchs.
Well, it was also interesting that it was largely white men, couple of white women, 1 black man, and then the closing shot there is of 3 black people walking up to the podium at the General Assembly. So they kind of had to cover themselves a little bit by adding that footage at the end. I'm sure there was a prominent African American Presbyterian in that shot, but still, about the 15 people that they showed of those heroes of the church, only 1 of them was black.
Yeah, and then they do this co-moderator thing now, where they'll have a couple of women or various of the gender and sexual preference letters, and they have diversity at the 2 and 3 headed moderator thing at the Northern Church.
Standing here before some of the great figures in Presbyterian history, we see a chest of memories inhabited by people very much like us. The little church of ardor and order made its way from Europe to America, fought a revolution, sent missions to the frontiers, split during the Civil War, was buffeted by every storm of controversy, and yet managed to survive as one thread in the rich tapestry of religion in America. At its best and at its worst, the Presbyterian tribe is the many faces of the past, its buildings, worship, and writings. But it is also the living present, where the church borrows glory and value from the living Lord to serve an aching world.
Well, there you go. Cue the outro.
It's
So,
over already?
Yeah, and well, there you have it. The Presbyterians, a documentary from 1974.
I would say that concluding paragraph was pretty well done. I mean, I might have tried to make it a little bit more punchy in an orthodox way, but as a way of trying to put together, summarize what the church has tried to do, even to mention trying to serve the living Lord, uh, was pretty religious. But I mean, the irony is that I think the whole video shows that the church is lockstep with the United States. It's in many respects on the same side of the causes the United States is on. And then also the church does a lot of the same stuff that the United States does when it comes to welfare, various kinds of programs, international work, international aid, education. These are all things the nation does. So it's in some ways really hard to tell the difference between the church and the nation in this movie. And I think they're pretty proud of that.
Did you notice that there was no mention of Vietnam whatsoever?
Yeah, no, I didn't notice that, but you're precisely right.
Oh! Would Vietnam be relevant in the memories in 1974?
You know, I can remember, I was born in 65, and I remember the body counts. And I remember watching the news at, 5 or 6 o'clock. And I remember yelling to my mother who was in the kitchen making dinner, we killed 5,000 today and we only lost 300 or something like that. And that's what they did. They had a tote board, on the newscast, and they reported casualty figures daily, none of which were probably accurate or true. But yeah, but the fact is, in 1974, even the mainline Presbyterians would largely have been politically conservative or moderate, and
Right.
they would have not been far leftist. The church had not been completely hijacked by progressives and hard left Marxists as they have been today, and they were much more politically moderate. So that probably explains why he didn't mention Vietnam much, because it was not a it was not a there was no settled position on that. I mean, there was at the headquarters level, but there wasn't at the local church level uh, to any degree. I don't think.
Right. I think that's exactly right, that they couldn't get away with taking a side on Vietnam that would please anyone. So they just avoided it. Um, which also makes me think, to any of your listeners who may know students in colleges or universities, a thesis, a senior thesis, a master's thesis about this movie, and trying to find the files of the people who contributed to it, what kind of negotiations they had to make, could actually be really fascinating as a picture. This is said by a history geek, of course, but still, it could actually reveal some of the politics of the PCUSA at the time and the way that they understood themselves in relationship to society.
Well, that's good. Somebody might benefit from that. Um, what are the lessons to us today from just a quick watch of this? I mean, what do we? I mean, we're reminded of the. I mean, I guess the Northern Church was just right on the precipice of falling off the cliff at this point. They probably were still quite large, although their influence was waning. But just the huge declines they've seen since I don't know, when did it really start, the decline? Was it in the right around 1980? I
I think
mean,
it was after the 80s.
okay,
Yeah. I mean, in
so
the 80s and beyond.
right, so
Um,
so you
I
never
mean,
know where you're going.
yeah. I mean, one lesson is beware how dated your movie is going to look, and so beware how much money you're going to vote to a production like this. Um, but I mean, I think I'm just repeating myself to talk about the way the church identifies with the nation or not. Um, Obviously, I have a spirituality of the church perspective, and so I see very little acknowledgement of that sort of position in this movie. And I do think that that position is not an odd one. It's there within the Reformed tradition, and it sometimes is compromised by or in conflict with the ideas of having an established religion and how the church functions in a society where it is the established church, say Scotland or Ireland or England. But you know, the movie started off too talking about the importance of Scripture, but it didn't talk much about Scripture after that, as far as the kind of positions and work the church was doing. So, where did the Bible go? We got it down in the 16th century. That's great, but and now that gives us the freedom to do what we want to do, conceivably.
Yeah, well, we've moved on from that, or they have. One thing that we should have mentioned at the beginning, you wonder what the audience was for this movie, whether it was just sent around to the churches and the presbyteries, maybe it was a kind of a recruiting film or a new members class sort of thing. I mean, every church had a 16 millimeter sound projector. I'm not thinking that they bought time and, showed it on Saturday morning or after the news shows on Sunday morning or anything like that. I doubt that it was ever on television. But I'm thinking it's mostly for internal use. But any thoughts on that?
I think that's right. It probably was an introduction to the church for people coming in from the outside, and even for some adult education in the lines of church history. But I wouldn't be surprised if during those public service hours that television stations were supposed to give, if maybe 5 o'clock on a Saturday morning, it's they stuck this on there. It's 28 minutes or so you can fill up a half hour slot. You can tell the FCC you did your public work this way. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it got an airing somewhere in a small way, but not in a major network kind of way.
Yeah, yeah. Since I don't know, the fairness doctor is gone, but some of those public service requirements on the TV stations have been relaxed as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
All right. Well, we've gone longer than I thought it would take a good while to go through this, and with our peanut gallery, it took a little longer than expected. But Presbycast always takes longer than expected. But it's been
That's because
fun,
we
and
talk at a normal speed.
that's right. We talk like regular people. So, Resby, Amish, any thoughts about all this?
No, I was kind of taking same way that Dr. Hart was, like just how like quickly, the gospel scripture was jettisoned, and it just became like a commercial for look at all the social good that we're doing. It's the order quickly got jettisoned, and the focus is on the order just to keep with the theme here.
Yeah, it was confusing, but consistent, at least in its usage and repetition. We all know that repetition very important. So, well, there we go. We did this. One listener sent it to me, and we just thought, yeah, well, of course we'll do this because it's the kind of thing we would do. And I knew that there was only one person to turn to, and that's our friend Dr. Hart. And we don't know how many times you've been on the show in the past 5 years, but it's a few. And I do think we've seen more of your cat tonight than ever. But we didn't have a large image on the screen, so there probably won't be any screen caps of you. And which cat do we have here?
That was Cordelia.
Cordelia.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Well, and we hope Mrs. Hart and Cordelia are doing well. anything you'd like to add before? We hoped we would have had time to do a little bit of, but we will commend this article. You wrote an article sort of in reaction to the letter that's going around in the PCA, and maybe we'll talk about this again before too long. But I would tell everyone to go to oldlife.org and read "Broadening Churches Break, Will the PCA?" So do you have a 30-second summary of this article?
Well, it actually kind of pairs well with what we've been talking about about this movie, which is this theme of the church broadening or not, and I'm raising the question of whether it's possible to talk about the PCA broadening and whether you can remain conservative when you're broadening, and drawing parallels between what happened in the PCUSA in the 1920s and 30s and what's going on now in the PCA. So I was, Chortles, you encouraged me to maybe write something about this, and I was glad actually to sort of spend a little time reflecting on that. The Keller piece about why he likes the PCA, where good faith subscription stands in all this. Again, I'm an outsider. I'm only in the OPC, but it's in some ways a common history that Presbyterians share, whether you're in the main line or the sidelines. So people should read it for what it's worth.
And one of our PCA historians calls the PCA a conservative mainline church.
Yes.
So that may be more accurate than we maybe at one time thought.
Right.
So the Presbyterian controversies do sort of they don't exactly repeat, but they do rhyme, and it's always, when we look back, we always see parallels with today, and that's northern and southern, and well, probably in other parts of the world too. But we're glad that you joined us, and it was as much fun as we thought it would be, and probably more informational than I expected as well.
No, it was fun. I was glad to do it. Thank you.
Well, thanks, and we'll let Presby tell everybody good night. And Amish, thanks for joining us. We value your input on the show, being a sounding board.
Thank you for having me.
Yep, we're glad for it. So, Presby, I'll turn it over to you as we do.
Well, thank you to everyone for watching. We did do the musical episode, but now we're branching out into film commentary. Ben Glazer asked me to give it a number rating. On the old one watch, everybody knows the rules. Rating scale. So, in the interest of balance and ardor and order, I'm gonna go 7-7. Just to make sure that we've got everything we need. So that's the official rating, and take that for what you will. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks everyone for listening. If you are only listening to this, I strongly encourage you to come on our YouTube channel and find the video for it, because again, just that the final shot of the Presbyterians of the opening, like, all you're missing is the white tree, and that is absolutely Minas Tirith in Gondor, with all the ardor and disorder that comes with it. So this is PresbyCast. This is Presby Science Theater 3000, reminding you to please don't be a nerdman.
'Twas the greatest of all discoveries when I found Jesus, my Lord.
Magic on the internet worldwide.